You're not qualified anymore, Evelyn. The words landed clean, sharp, and deliberate, cutting through the polished stillness of the glass-walled conference room as if they had been rehearsed. For a moment, no one moved. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind them in quiet indifference, late morning sunlight reflecting off steel and glass, casting long, cold beams across the 12-foot oak table where power was usually negotiated in softer tones. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch. She stood at the far end of the room, a single tablet in her hand, dressed in a tailored navy blazer that spoke of restraint rather than status, her heels planted firmly against the marble floor. Around the table, a dozen executives shifted subtly, exchanging glances they thought were discreet. Some recognized her. Most pretended not to. A few leaned back in their chairs, curious, as if they had just been handed unexpected entertainment in the middle of an otherwise predictable quarterly strategy meeting. Daniel Brooks remained seated at the head of the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression composed with the kind of confidence that came from years of never being challenged in rooms like this. He didn't look at her the way he once had. There was no warmth left, no familiarity, only calculation. Your proposal, he continued, his voice measured, almost polite, is outdated. It doesn't align with where this company is going. A faint ripple of agreement moved through the room, not because they believed him, but because they understood the unspoken rule: you don't contradict the CEO. Evelyn nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a minor correction rather than a public dismissal. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the quiet judgment layered beneath corporate neutrality. To them, she was a ghost from a version of Daniel's life that had been carefully erased, an inconvenient footnote in a story that now featured growth charts, acquisitions, and a fiancé who appeared in glossy magazines. Someone near the middle of the table cleared his throat. Another checked his watch. The meeting was already moving on without her. Daniel reached for a file, signaling the end of the discussion with a subtle shift in posture that everyone else immediately understood. We'll proceed with the internal strategy, he said, not looking at her anymore. Thank you for your input. Input. The word hung in the air, sanitized and dismissive. Evelyn lowered her tablet slightly, her fingers relaxing around its edge. 5 years ago, she would have tried to explain, to defend, to make him see what he was refusing to acknowledge. 5 years ago, she would have mistaken silence for defeat. Now, she simply inhaled, slow and steady, grounding herself in the quiet rhythm of her own breath. The room smelled faintly of espresso and polished wood, familiar in a distant way, like a place she had once lived in but no longer belonged to. She let the silence stretch just a fraction longer than expected, not enough to break decorum, but enough to be noticed. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Understood, she said, her voice calm, even, and entirely unbothered. It wasn't the response they expected. No tension, no embarrassment, no visible crack in her composure. Just acceptance. Or something that looked very much like it. A few of them frowned slightly, sensing something they couldn't quite define. Daniel didn't react at all. He had already moved on, already convinced the moment was over. Evelyn turned, her heels making a soft, measured sound against the marble as she walked toward the door. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. And that was the detail no one in the room would understand until it was far too late. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it should have, the kind of artificial chill that came from overworked air conditioning and conversations that never quite reached the surface, and yet Evelyn Carter walked through it as if she had stepped into a different atmosphere entirely, one where the weight of the room behind her no longer applied. The glass door closed with a soft, controlled click, sealing off the low hum of corporate voices that had already begun to erase her presence from memory, and still she did not slow down, her pace steady, measured, unhurried in a way that suggested she was not leaving in defeat but exiting on her own terms. A junior analyst standing near the reception desk glanced up, recognition flickering across his face for just a second before uncertainty replaced it, as if he could not quite place why her name felt familiar, and Evelyn noticed, not with irritation, not with pride, but with a quiet acknowledgement of how easily people forgot what no longer served them. 5 years ago, she had walked these same polished floors with a different posture, shoulders slightly drawn inward, always half a step behind Daniel, always adjusting her presence to match the space he allowed her, and now the memory surfaced not as pain, but as distance, like watching a version of herself that had belonged to someone else. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside alone. Pressing the button for the ground floor with the same calm precision she had shown in the meeting, her reflection catching briefly in the mirrored panel, not lingering, not searching for validation, just observing, and for a moment the silence wrapped around her, uninterrupted, clean, almost deliberate. Her phone vibrated once in her hand, a subtle interruption, and she glanced down at the screen where a single message waited, no name attached, just a simple line that read, "Are you in position?" And she did not reply immediately, letting the question sit there as the elevator began its smooth descent. Each passing floor marked by a quiet mechanical tone that counted time in a way the meeting never could. Above her, behind layers of glass and steel, decisions were being made under the assumption that everything was proceeding as planned, that control remained exactly where it had always been, that nothing of significance had shifted, and that was the detail that mattered most, because control, she had learned, was rarely about who spoke the loudest in the room, but about who understood the full shape of the board. Before the first move was even visible, the elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors sliding open to reveal the expansive lobby where sunlight poured in through 30-foot windows, warming the marble in a way the upper floors never allowed, and Evelyn stepped forward without hesitation, her heels echoing softly in the open space as she crossed toward the exit, past the security desk, past the revolving doors that separated the carefully managed world inside from the unpredictable rhythm of the city beyond. Outside, the air felt different, warmer, alive with the distant sound of traffic and the muted pulse of a world that did not revolve around quarterly projections or curated reputations, and she paused just long enough to take a single breath, not for reassurance, not for strength, but as if marking the exact moment something invisible had already begun to turn. Her phone vibrated again, the same message thread, a second line appearing beneath the first, "The board is waiting." And this time, Evelyn allowed herself the faintest shift in expression, not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, but something quieter, more certain, before she finally typed her response with deliberate clarity, "Give them 5 minutes," and as she slipped the phone back into her bag and stepped forward into the sunlight, there was no urgency in her movement, no need to rush, because what was about to happen next did not depend on her presence in that room, only on her timing. And for the first time since she had walked away from everything that once defined her, timing was entirely hers. Inside the conference room, the conversation had already shifted, the earlier exchange filed away as a minor interruption in an otherwise routine agenda, and Daniel Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting on the polished surface of the table as a senior director moved through a series of projections displayed on the wall, numbers rising and falling in neat, predictable patterns that reassured everyone in the room that control was intact. No one mentioned Evelyn Carter again. Not directly, but her absence lingered in the subtle glances exchanged between a few of the older board members who remembered more than they said, who understood that history did not disappear simply because it was no longer acknowledged. If we secure the additional capital, we can accelerate expansion by at least 18 months, the director was saying, his voice steady, confident, built on assumptions that had not yet been tested. And Daniel nodded once, approving, because this was the version of reality he preferred, one where outcomes followed intention, where influence remained predictable, where variables were minimized and contained. Near the far end of the table, a woman in a charcoal suit tapped her pen lightly against her notepad, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she was calculating something beyond the slide deck, and after a brief pause, she spoke, "We are still waiting on confirmation from the external investor, correct?" And the room shifted. Almost imperceptibly, attention tightening, because that was the one piece not yet secured, the one factor that had the potential to change the trajectory of everything they were discussing. Daniel straightened slightly, his tone controlled. "We have strong indications." It is a formality at this point, and the confidence in his voice was enough to settle most doubts, because it always had been, because for years his certainty had been mistaken for inevitability. The assistant seated near the door glanced at her tablet, her brow tightening just enough to be noticed by no one but herself, and then, after a brief hesitation, she stood and crossed the room quietly, leaning toward Daniel to speak in a low voice that was meant to remain private but carried just enough for the nearest executives to catch fragments of it. His expression did not change at first, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle recalibration that was almost invisible unless you were looking for it, and he nodded once, dismissing her with a brief gesture before turning his attention back to the room. "We will take a short pause," he said, his voice even, controlled. "It seems our investor has arrived earlier than expected." And a ripple of anticipation moved through the table, chairs adjusting, jackets straightened, the atmosphere sharpening with a sudden awareness that something important was about to unfold. Outside, beyond the glass walls, movement could be seen near the reception area, a figure approaching with deliberate calm, unaccompanied, unhurried, and for a moment no one inside the room recognized the significance of what they were seeing, because they were still operating under the assumption that power announced itself with noise, with presence, with spectacle. Daniel rose to his feet, smoothing the front of his suit in a gesture that was more habit than necessity, his mind already aligning itself with the version of the meeting that would follow, one where he would extend a handshake, offer a controlled welcome, and secure the final piece of a plan he believed he had already mastered. The door remained closed for just a second longer than expected, the silence stretching into something that felt almost intentional. And then the handle turned slowly, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room, and as the door began to open, there was a brief, suspended moment where everything still appeared exactly as it had been, unchanged, predictable, controlled, and that was the moment right before it no longer was. The door opened without urgency, without ceremony, and yet the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a change in air pressure before a storm, and for a fraction of a second no one spoke because the figure standing at the threshold did not match the expectation they had already constructed in their minds. Evelyn Carter stepped inside as if she had never left, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, her presence quiet in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. And the assistant who had just announced the arrival of the investor lingered a step behind her, uncertain now, as if even she was realizing that something about this moment was not unfolding according to script. Daniel Brooks did not move at first, his hand still resting against the back of his chair, his gaze fixed on Evelyn with a focus that sharpened by the second, as recognition collided with disbelief in a way he could not immediately reconcile, and around the table the executives shifted again, but this time there was no pretense of indifference, only a growing awareness that the situation had slipped beyond their assumptions. The woman in the charcoal suit straightened slightly, her pen no longer tapping, her attention fully anchored on the doorway as if recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the meeting. Evelyn closed the distance between herself and the table with measured steps, the soft sound of her heels echoing against marble and glass, not rushed, not hesitant, each step deliberate in a way that seemed to rewrite the rhythm of the room itself. And when she reached the far side of the table, she stopped, placing her tablet gently on the surface as if it belonged there, as if she belonged there. No one spoke. Not yet, because the script they had been following no longer applied, and it was in that silence that the smallest details became impossible to ignore, the way she did not seek permission to stand where she stood, the way her gaze moved across the room not as an outsider but as someone already familiar with its power dynamics, already aware of every unspoken hierarchy that governed it. Daniel finally exhaled, a controlled breath that carried more tension than he intended, and straightened fully, reclaiming the posture that had defined him for years. "Evelyn," he said, her name measured, neutral, carefully stripped of any trace of the history that hung between them. "This is a closed board session," and the words were precise, professional, positioned as a boundary, as if stating it would re-establish control over a moment that was already slipping. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching, without challenge, and for a brief second there was something almost reflective in her expression, as if she were observing him rather than reacting, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying just enough weight to settle into the room without force. "I am aware," she said, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic, simply factual, and that was the detail that unsettled more than anything else, because it suggested she had not walked in by mistake. The assistant near the door shifted again, glancing between Daniel and Evelyn as if waiting for clarification that did not come, and the room held its breath in that quiet space between expectation and reality. One of the board members leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing with curiosity that bordered on realization. But not quite, not yet, and Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he measured the moment, calculating, searching for the angle that would restore the narrative he had already constructed. "Then I suggest you step out," he said, his voice firmer now, an attempt to close the loop, to reassert the hierarchy that had always worked in his favor, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to lean toward that outcome, toward the familiar pattern where his authority went unquestioned. Evelyn did not move, not even an inch, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was charged, layered with something deeper, something waiting just beneath the surface, and as her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, her gaze steady, composed, there was a shift so subtle it could almost be missed, the kind that did not announce itself but changed everything all the same, and somewhere in that room, just beyond words, the first crack in Daniel's certainty began to form. No one spoke for a full second after Daniel's words settled into the air, the kind of silence that did not feel empty but suspended, as if the room itself was waiting for something it could not yet define, and Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table as though the space had already accepted her presence whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Daniel held her gaze, expecting resistance, perhaps even discomfort, something he could counter, something familiar, but what he found instead was something far more unsettling, a complete absence of urgency, as if his authority no longer carried the weight it once did, and that was the first moment the imbalance began to tilt in a way no one had planned for. Across the table, the woman in the charcoal suit shifted her attention from Daniel to Evelyn, her expression sharpening into something more analytical, as if a missing piece had just entered the equation, and one by one the others followed, their focus no longer anchored to the head of the table but drifting, recalibrating, quietly questioning. The assistant near the door cleared her throat softly, stepping forward with a tablet in hand, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a careful professionalism as she addressed the room. "There has been an update regarding the investor," she said, her voice steady but carrying just enough tension to cut through the silence, and every head turned toward her in unison, drawn by the shift in tone more than the words themselves. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his patience thinning as the meeting slipped further from the structure he had established. "We will address that in a moment," he replied, his voice controlled but edged now, an attempt to restore order, to reassert the sequence he had already decided upon. But the assistant did not step back this time, did not retreat into the background as expected. And instead she glanced briefly at Evelyn before continuing. "The lead representative is already present," she said, and the words landed differently, heavier, carrying a meaning that moved through the room like a slow current, touching each person in a slightly different way before settling into something undeniable. Daniel turned his head slightly, following the direction of her glance, and for a brief second the connection was almost there, almost understood, but not fully accepted, not yet. Because accepting it would require dismantling the certainty he had built so carefully. Evelyn did not rush to fill the silence, did not step forward or claim the moment. She simply stood there, composed, allowing the realization to unfold at its own pace, and that restraint, that refusal to force the truth, was what gave it weight. A board member near the center leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough to break through the tension. "Are you saying," he began, then stopped, as if even forming the question felt premature. And the assistant nodded once, a small, definitive gesture that carried more authority than any formal announcement. The shift was immediate, subtle but irreversible, like a line being crossed that could not be uncrossed, and Daniel felt it before he fully understood it, a quiet fracture in the structure of control he had relied on for years. His mind moving quickly now, recalculating, searching for context that would restore logic to what no longer made sense. "That is not possible," he said finally, the words measured but lacking the certainty they once held, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, there was a trace of something else beneath his composure, something closer to doubt. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, not triumphant, not cold, simply present, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle in its clarity. "It already happened," she said, and the room seemed to absorb the words all at once, the meaning settling into place with a quiet finality that left no room for reinterpretation. No one moved, no one interrupted, because in that moment the dynamic had shifted completely, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a single, undeniable truth. And Daniel Brooks, standing at the head of the table, realized that the meeting he thought he was controlling no longer belonged to him at all. The silence did not break immediately, it settled, deeper this time, heavier, as if every person in the room was recalculating their position in real time, and Evelyn Carter did not move to claim the center of it. She simply existed within it, steady, grounded, allowing the weight of her words to do what years of explanation never could. Daniel Brooks remained standing, but the posture that once signaled authority now felt slightly out of place, as though the room had shifted around him without permission. And for a brief moment his mind reached backward, searching for something familiar to anchor himself to, some version of Evelyn that fit the narrative he had long believed. But the woman standing in front of him did not match any of those memories. 5 years ago, she had stood in a different room, smaller, less polished, holding a stack of documents she barely understood while he explained, patiently at first and then with growing impatience, why certain decisions had to be made without her, why her role was to support, not to question, and she had nodded back then, not because she agreed, but because she believed that was what partnership required. The memory flickered through his mind now without invitation, sharp and inconvenient, and it collided with the present in a way that made no sense. Because the woman who had once deferred to him now stood in a position he had not even considered possible. Across the table, the board members were no longer pretending neutrality, their attention fully engaged, their expressions shifting from confusion to calculation, and one of them, an older man with silver hair and decades of experience behind his measured gaze, leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. "Are we to understand that you represent the capital allocation for this round?" he asked, directing the question not to Daniel, but to Evelyn, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked a turning point no one could ignore. Evelyn met his gaze with the same calm composure. "I do," she said, her voice steady, unembellished, offering no additional explanation, no attempt to justify or elaborate, and that restraint carried more weight than any detailed presentation could have. Daniel felt the room pivot in that instant, not dramatically, not with open challenge, but with a quiet redirection of attention that moved away from him and toward her, and it was that movement, more than anything she had said, that unsettled him. "That is not what was communicated," he replied, his tone controlled but edged with something tighter now, something closer to urgency, and for the first time he stepped away from the head of the table, closing a small portion of the distance between them as if proximity might restore clarity. Evelyn did not step back, did not mirror the movement, she remained exactly where she was, her presence unshaken. "No," she said softly. It was not, and the simplicity of the statement carried an implication that did not need to be spoken, that not everything had been disclosed, that not everything had been within his control. The assistant placed a document on the table, sliding it forward with careful precision, and the soft sound of paper against wood seemed louder than it should have, drawing every eye to the single sheet that now sat between them, and Daniel's gaze dropped to it instinctively, scanning the header, the signature block, the numbers that followed, each detail aligning into something he could not dismiss, could not reinterpret, and the realization settled slowly, deliberately, leaving no room for denial. Around him, the room adjusted again, chairs shifting, postures straightening, the unspoken hierarchy recalibrating in real time, and the same executives who had watched Evelyn with polite indifference less than 10 minutes ago now regarded her with a different kind of attention, one that carried weight, recognition, and something approaching respect. Evelyn allowed the moment to unfold without interruption, her silence no longer passive but intentional, and as Daniel lifted his gaze back to hers, the certainty that had defined him for so long felt thinner, less absolute, because the version of the story he had been telling himself no longer held, and for the first time he was no longer the one setting the terms of the conversation. He was reacting to it, and the shift, once it happened, could not be undone. The document did not leave Daniel Brooks's hand immediately, his fingers holding the edge a fraction longer than necessary as if delaying the final acceptance of what it represented, and across from him Evelyn Carter remained still, her composure unshaken, her presence no longer something that could be dismissed or redirected, because the room had already begun to shift in ways that no one could reverse. The numbers on the page were precise, undeniable, structured with the kind of authority that did not require explanation. And yet it was not the scale of the investment that unsettled him, it was the name attached to it, the quiet confirmation that the person he had just dismissed minutes earlier now occupied a position that placed her above the entire conversation. A low murmur moved through the board members, controlled but no longer silent, the kind of restrained reaction that carried more meaning than open surprise. And the silver-haired man leaned back slightly, his expression no longer questioning but resolved, as if a conclusion had been reached without the need for further debate. "Well," he said calmly, folding his hands together, "that certainly changes the structure of this meeting," and no one disagreed, because there was nothing left to dispute. Daniel set the document down slowly, deliberately, his mind moving through possibilities, searching for a version of events that restored balance, but each option dissolved as quickly as it formed, because the facts in front of him did not bend to interpretation, they stood on their own, complete and immovable. "You should have disclosed this," he said finally, his voice measured but tighter now, directed at Evelyn as if the responsibility for the disruption rested with her, as if the situation could still be framed as a procedural oversight rather than a fundamental shift in power. Evelyn's gaze did not waver, and when she responded, her tone remained even, almost quiet. "You did not ask," she said, and the simplicity of the answer cut deeper than any accusation, because it reflected something he had not considered, that his certainty had never left room for the possibility that she no longer needed his approval to enter the room. A few of the executives exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried silent acknowledgement, because they understood what had just been revealed was not only financial, it was structural, it was strategic, and it positioned Evelyn in a way that extended far beyond a single meeting. Daniel exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, attempting to reclaim the role he had occupied for years. "This does not change our internal direction," he said, his voice steadying as he spoke, anchoring himself to the framework he knew. "We still need to align on execution," and for a moment it almost worked. Almost restored the rhythm of the meeting, but not entirely. Because the center of attention had already shifted, and everyone in the room felt it, Evelyn reached for the tablet she had placed on the table earlier, her fingers moving with calm precision as she turned the screen toward the group, and the soft glow illuminated a series of projections that differed from the ones they had been reviewing, more refined, more complete, built on a perspective that extended beyond internal assumptions. "Execution requires clarity," she said, her voice steady. "And clarity requires accurate positioning," and she let the words settle, not forcing them, not elaborating, allowing the implications to form on their own. The woman in the charcoal suit leaned forward slightly, her interest no longer guarded. "Are you suggesting a revision?" she asked, and Evelyn met her gaze with the same composed certainty. "I am suggesting alignment with reality," she replied, and the room absorbed the statement in silence. Because it carried a weight that could not be ignored, Daniel watched her, really watched her this time, not as someone from his past, not as a disruption to be managed, but as a presence that had redefined the terms of the conversation entirely, and for the first time he understood that this was not a moment he could control, it was a moment he had to navigate, and that distinction, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of something he had not prepared for at all. The room did not return to its previous rhythm. It could not, because something fundamental had already shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by routine or authority. And as the projection from Evelyn Carter's tablet illuminated the center of the table, the contrast became impossible to ignore, her data cleaner, sharper, structured with a clarity that suggested not only preparation but foresight. The executives leaned in, almost unconsciously, drawn not by spectacle, but by precision, by the quiet confidence embedded in every number and projection, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, the focus of the room was no longer reactive, it was engaged. Daniel Brooks remained standing, but the position no longer elevated him in the same way. It isolated him slightly, placing him just outside the center of a conversation that was no longer entirely his to control. And he felt it in the way the questions began to form, not directed at him, but toward her. "These projections assume external leverage beyond our current channels," the woman in the charcoal suit observed, her tone analytical, curious rather than skeptical, and Evelyn nodded once. "They reflect access that was not previously integrated," she replied, her voice steady, allowing the implication to settle without overstatement, because she did not need to prove it, it was already present in the structure she had laid out. A younger executive shifted in his chair, glancing between the two sets of data, the difference becoming clearer with each passing second. "This would accelerate market entry by at least 2 quarters, he said, almost to himself, and the realization moved outward from him like a ripple, each person in the room recalibrating their understanding of what was now possible. Daniel stepped forward then, closing the distance between himself and the table, not abruptly, but with intention, his mind adjusting, searching for a position that allowed him to remain within the structure of control. "Assumptions are not execution," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier steadiness. "We need guarantees, not projections," and for a moment the room paused again, the familiar tone of authority re-entering the space, attempting to re-establish a framework everyone understood. Evelyn turned her gaze toward him, not confrontational, not defensive, simply present, and for a brief second the noise of the room faded into something quieter, more focused, as if the moment itself was narrowing. "That is correct," she said, her tone calm, agreeing without resistance, and the response created a subtle shift, disarming the expected opposition, leaving space for something else to emerge, "which is why this is not a projection," she continued, her hand moving slightly as she brought up a final page, one that had not yet been displayed. And the document that appeared was not speculative, it was definitive. Structured, signed, aligned with the earlier paper now resting in front of Daniel, the numbers matched, the terms aligned, the execution already in motion. No one spoke immediately, because the distinction was clear now. What had been dismissed minutes earlier was no longer a possibility, it was a reality already set into place, already moving forward without waiting for approval. The silver-haired board member leaned back again. A faint exhale escaping him, not of tension but of acknowledgement. "Then we are not discussing whether this happens," he said slowly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that settled across the room. "We are discussing how we move with it." And this time, no one looked to Daniel for confirmation. The shift was complete, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute in its subtlety, and Daniel felt it in the way the room no longer paused for his direction, the way decisions began to form around a different center. One he had not anticipated. Evelyn did not claim the moment with words, she allowed it to unfold, her silence now a form of presence that anchored the conversation without forcing it, and as the executives began to speak again, their questions sharper, more focused, aligned with the framework she had introduced, it became clear that the meeting had not ended when she was dismissed earlier, it had only just begun, and this time, it was no longer built on his assumptions, but on her reality. The conversation no longer belonged to a single voice, it expanded, led, shaped by a momentum that had quietly shifted away from control and toward alignment, and as the executives leaned further into Evelyn Carter's framework, their questions became sharper, more intentional, reflecting not doubt but engagement. "What is the timeline for full integration?" one of them asked, his tone focused. "Already thinking in terms of execution rather than approval," and Evelyn responded without hesitation. 90 days for structural alignment, 60 for operational deployment, her voice calm, precise, each word measured in a way that suggested the process had already been mapped long before this room had considered it. Daniel Brooks remained standing at the edge of the table, his presence no longer commanding the same automatic deference, and for a moment he watched the exchange unfold without interruption, his mind working through layers of realization that did not come all at once, but settled in stages, each one more difficult to dismiss than the last. 5 years ago, he had believed that removing her from the company, from the structure, from the narrative, had been a necessary decision, efficient, strategic, clean, and he had moved forward without looking back, confident that the outcome had reinforced his position, that it had clarified the direction he wanted to take. But standing here now, watching her recalibrate the very system he had built, that certainty felt less absolute, less complete, and risk exposure. The woman in the charcoal suit added, her pen now still, her attention fixed. "What are we not seeing?" And the question carried weight, not as a challenge, but as an expectation of depth, of transparency, and Evelyn held her gaze for a brief second before answering. "You are not seeing limitations," she said quietly, "because the model does not rely on them," and the room absorbed the statement, not as arrogance, but as confidence rooted in preparation. A subtle shift followed, the kind that did not announce itself but changed the tone of the discussion, because the conversation was no longer about whether the plan could work, it was about how quickly it could be implemented. Daniel stepped forward again, this time not to interrupt, but to reposition himself within the flow, his voice steady but more deliberate now. "If this moves forward," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we need clarity on leadership alignment," and it was the closest he had come to acknowledging the shift without stating it directly. Evelyn turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her voice even. "Leadership aligns with execution," she replied, and the simplicity of the statement carried an implication that extended beyond the immediate discussion, something that reached into the structure of authority itself. The silver-haired board member glanced between them, his expression thoughtful, as if observing not just the strategy, but the dynamic unfolding beneath it, and after a brief pause, he spoke again. "Then perhaps it is time we redefine roles based on current position rather than past structure," and the word settled into the room with quiet finality, not forceful, not confrontational, but decisive in a way that left little room for resistance. No one objected, not openly, because the logic was clear, the alignment already visible in the way the conversation had shifted, in the way the room now moved with Evelyn's direction rather than around Daniel's authority. Evelyn did not respond immediately, she did not claim the statement or reinforce it, she simply allowed it to exist, to take root on its own, because she understood something that could not be rushed, that real power did not need to be declared, it only needed to be recognized. Daniel's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, not searching for weakness anymore, but for understanding, for a way to reconcile the past with the present, and what he found was not resistance, not triumph, but something quieter, something more composed, a version of Evelyn Carter that no longer required his validation to exist in the room. And as the discussion continued, flowing naturally, seamlessly, built on the structure she had introduced, it became clear to everyone present that the shift was no longer theoretical, it was already in motion, already shaping outcomes. And the only question left was not whether it would hold, but how. Each of them would adapt to a reality that had changed without asking for permission. The momentum in the room did not slow, it refined itself, becoming sharper, more focused, as if every person present had quietly accepted that the direction of the meeting had shifted and there was no value in resisting it, and Evelyn Carter stood at the center of that shift without ever claiming it, her presence steady, her voice measured only when necessary, allowing the structure she had introduced to carry the weight of the conversation. "We will need immediate coordination with external partners," one of the executives said, already moving into logistics, and Evelyn nodded slightly. "They are already briefed," she replied, her tone calm, and the statement landed with a quiet finality that removed yet another layer of uncertainty from the room. Daniel Brooks listened, not interrupting this time, his attention no longer fixed on regaining control but on understanding the scope of what had unfolded, and as he watched the interaction, the realization settled deeper, not as a sudden shock but as a gradual clarity that could not be reversed, that the structure he had built, the system he had controlled, was now expanding beyond the boundaries he had set, and it was doing so under her direction. The woman in the charcoal suit exchanged a brief glance with the silver-haired board member, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and then she turned back to Evelyn. "If we move forward under your model, we will need oversight integration at the highest level," she said, her voice steady, and this time the implication was direct, unmistakable. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She allowed the weight of the statement to settle, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to the table, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority that had defined every word she had said since entering. "Oversight aligns with responsibility," she said, and the simplicity of the response carried a structure within it, one that did not need to be explained because it was already understood. Daniel felt the shift fully then, not as a possibility, not as a challenge, but as a fact, and for a moment he looked around the room, really looked, noticing the subtle changes he had missed before, the way attention no longer defaulted to him, the way decisions were forming through a different lens, one that included him but no longer revolved around him. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, not retreating, but recalibrating, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, still controlled, still composed, but no longer anchored in assumption. "Then we proceed with alignment," he said, the words deliberate, and for the first time, they did not sound like a command, they sounded like acceptance. A quiet acknowledgement moved through the room, not verbal, not formal, but present in the way shoulders relaxed slightly, in the way the conversation resumed without hesitation, and in that moment, the transition was complete, not marked by confrontation, not sealed by argument, but by recognition. Evelyn closed the final document on her tablet, the soft click almost inaudible, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to observe the room, not with triumph, not with vindication, but with a quiet understanding of how far she had come, how much had changed without needing to be announced. Daniel's gaze met hers again, and this time there was no dismissal, no distance, only a measured acknowledgement of something he had not anticipated but could no longer deny, and though no apology was spoken, no past revisited, the shift between them was clear, defined not by words, but by position. The meeting continued, structured, focused, moving forward with a clarity it had not possessed at the beginning, and as voices overlapped, decisions forming with increasing precision, it became evident to everyone present that this was no longer a discussion about possibility or approval. It was execution already in motion, shaped by a reality that had quietly rewritten the balance of power, and at the center of it, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, Evelyn Carter had become the point around which everything now aligned. The meeting did not end with a dramatic conclusion. It settled into something quieter, more deliberate, as if the room itself understood that what had just happened did not require a formal closing to be final, and one by one the executives began to gather their materials, not with the usual rush of urgency, but with a measured awareness that they had just witnessed a shift that would extend far beyond the walls of this conference room. Evelyn Carter remained where she was for a moment longer. Her tablet now closed, her posture relaxed but not diminished, as if she no longer needed to prove her place within the space because it had already been established without force. The silver-haired board member approached her first, his steps unhurried, his expression composed but carrying a subtle respect that had not been present earlier. "We should discuss long-term positioning," he said, his tone professional, but now aligned with her rather than directed past her, and Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without committing to more than the moment required, because she understood that influence did not come from immediate agreement, it came from control over timing. Across the room, the woman in the charcoal suit spoke quietly with two other executives, their conversation low but focused, their attention no longer scattered but aligned, and every so often their gaze shifted toward Evelyn, not with curiosity anymore, but with consideration, as if recalculating their own positions within a structure that had just been rewritten. Daniel Brooks stood near the head of the table, no longer at its center, his hands resting lightly against the back of his chair, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, he did not attempt to direct the flow around him. He observed it, his gaze moving across the room, taking in the subtle realignments, the quiet shifts in posture and tone that marked a deeper change than any single decision. When his eyes returned to Evelyn, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, no attempt to reframe what had happened, only a measured acknowledgement of the reality now standing in front of him, and though he said nothing, the silence between them carried a weight that words would have diminished. Evelyn finally moved, stepping away from the table with the same calm precision that had defined every action she had taken since entering the room, and as she walked toward the door, the space seemed to adjust around her, not dramatically, not with overt attention, but with a subtle awareness that followed her presence even as she left it. The assistant near the door straightened slightly, opening it without being asked, her expression composed but carrying a trace of something new, something closer to respect than routine, and Evelyn passed through without pause, without looking back, because she did not need to confirm what had already been established. The hallway beyond felt the same as it had before, cool, controlled, lined with glass and quiet conversations, but the difference was not in the space, it was in her, in the way she moved through it without hesitation, without the weight of expectation pressing against her shoulders, because for the first time, she was not entering this world on someone else's terms, she was shaping it on her own. Behind her, the door closed softly, sealing the room once more, but the shift inside did not disappear with her exit, it remained, embedded in the decisions that would follow, in the conversations that would continue long after the meeting was formally adjourned. And as Evelyn stepped into the elevator once again, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of herself that no longer carried the past as a burden but as a quiet foundation, she did not allow herself a smile, did not indulge in triumph, because she understood something far more powerful than victory, that she had not returned to take anything back, she had returned because she no longer needed what had once been taken from her, and that was what changed everything. The elevator descended in silence, a smooth, uninterrupted glide that mirrored the steadiness Evelyn Carter carried within herself, and as the numbers above the door shifted one by one, she allowed the quiet to settle around her without resistance, without the need to fill it with thought or reflection, because what had just happened did not require analysis, it required acceptance. And she had already reached that point long before she stepped into the building. The doors opened onto the lobby. With a soft chime, sunlight spilling across polished marble floors, and the contrast between the controlled tension of the conference room and the open rhythm of the city beyond felt almost symbolic. Though she did not linger on it, she simply stepped forward, her heels echoing lightly as she crossed the expansive space, each step grounded, unhurried, as if time itself had shifted to match her pace rather than the other way around. Behind her, far above, conversations were continuing, decisions being reshaped, structures adjusting to accommodate a reality that had already taken form, and she knew without needing confirmation that her presence in that room would continue to resonate long after she had left it, not because of what she had said, but because of what she had shown, a clarity that could not be undone. Outside, the air was warmer, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the layered sounds of a city that never paused for any single moment, and Evelyn stepped into it with the same composure she had carried inside, her expression calm, her gaze forward, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if this was simply the natural continuation of a path she had chosen long ago. Her phone vibrated once in her bag, a quiet interruption, and when she reached for it, the screen lit up with a message, concise, efficient, board-confirmed alignment, and for a brief second she held the phone in her hand without responding, not out of hesitation, but because the confirmation did not surprise her, it only affirmed what had already been set into motion. She typed a short reply, deliberate and precise, proceed as scheduled, and slipped the phone back into her bag without further thought, because there was no need to monitor what she had already secured. A car waited at the curb, dark, understated, blending into the flow of the city rather than standing apart from it, and as she approached, the driver stepped out, opening the door with a quiet professionalism that matched the tone of everything she had built, and Evelyn paused for a fraction of a second before entering, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but simply to mark the transition. The closing of one moment and the beginning of another, across the street, reflected faintly in the glass facade of the building she had just left. The upper floors shimmered in the midday light, distant now, almost abstract, and for a brief instant, the memory of who she had been in those rooms surfaced, not as regret, not as longing, but as contrast, a reminder of the distance she had traveled without needing to prove it to anyone else. She slid into the car, the door closing softly behind her, sealing off the noise of the street. And as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into traffic, there was no sense of urgency, no need to accelerate, because the outcome had already been decided long before this day began. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, and in the quiet space that followed, she understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that what she had done was not about reclaiming a place, not about correcting the past, but about stepping fully into a reality she had built piece by piece, choice by choice, without waiting for permission. And as the city moved around her, constant and unchanging in its motion, she did not look back, not because there was nothing behind her, but because there was nothing left there that could define her anymore. The car moved steadily through the city, blending into the rhythm of traffic that never paused, never questioned, and Evelyn Carter sat in the quiet interior without distraction, her gaze resting lightly on the passing reflections of glass towers and intersections that looked the same as they always had, unchanged, indifferent, and yet everything within her had shifted in a way that no one on the outside could see. Her phone remained silent now, the earlier confirmation already settled into place, no follow-up needed, no reassurance required, because she understood something that had taken years to learn, that real control did not come from constant validation, it came from knowing the outcome before it was announced. Somewhere behind her, high above the street, Daniel Brooks was still in that room, still navigating a structure that no longer responded to him in the same way, and she did not need to imagine it in detail, she did not need to replay the expressions or the silence, because the moment had already completed itself, sealed not by confrontation, but by recognition. The city outside continued in its usual patterns, pedestrians crossing at lights, taxis weaving through narrow openings, sunlight reflecting off windows in brief flashes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared, and Evelyn watched it all with a calm detachment that was not distance, but clarity, the kind that came from no longer needing to hold on to anything that had once defined her. She thought briefly, not about the meeting, not about Daniel, but about the years in between, the quiet work that had never been seen, the decisions made without applause, the nights where progress felt invisible, and the moments where walking away had been the only choice that preserved something deeper than success, and none of it felt heavy now, none of it lingered as regret, because it had all led to this exact alignment, this exact version of herself that did not require explanation. The car slowed slightly at an intersection, the red light casting a soft reflection across the windshield, and for a brief moment everything paused, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed, and in that stillness, Evelyn allowed herself a single breath, steady, grounded, not as a reaction, but as a quiet acknowledgement of completion. The light shifted to green, and the car moved forward again without hesitation, merging back into the flow, and she leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, because there was no need for visible emotion, no need for a moment of triumph or release, only the quiet certainty that what had been done did not need to be undone, explained, or repeated. She reached for her phone once more, not out of necessity, but with intention, opening a message thread that contained only a single name, one that had been there long before this day, and she typed a short line, simple, unadorned, "It is done," then paused for a fraction of a second before sending it, not waiting for a response, not expecting one immediately, because the message itself was not a request, it was a statement. The screen dimmed as she set the phone aside, and outside, the skyline stretched forward, wide and open, not as a destination, but as a continuation, something she would move through rather than toward, and in that quiet, unspoken space, one truth remained, steady and complete, not needing to be said aloud to exist, that she had never returned to prove anything, never stepped back into that world to reclaim what was lost, because the version of her that once needed that validation no longer existed, and as the city carried her forward, she understood with absolute clarity that the most powerful thing she had done was not to come back stronger, but to come back whole, and in doing so, she had become something no one in that room had ever expected, not a response, not a reaction, but the outcome itself.